to the very committed audience that made it this morning at 7:30. I have a range of super interesting experts up here with me who will share their view towards the future on a range of different topics in the session to essentially kickstart also the session and our conversation, because after the experts gave their input, it will also be up to the audience to provide, it says, feedback and their own views, so not just questions in this session. We're open to hear also how you think about the future. And I think the interesting point, obviously, is we all think about the future anyway, all the time, right? We get up in the morning, we choose what to wear, we try to see the weather forecast as much as it can be forecast, what will happen throughout the day. Obviously, none of this is certain, but we have an image of the future if we think about it consciously or not. And at the same time, if we don't do it consciously, there are a lot of biases in the human brain that kind of influence how we see the future. If we know someone who's been in a terrible accident recently, we suddenly are much more afraid to step on a plane, for example, even though it hasn't become, objectively more likely that there will be another accident, even less likely. And so these are kind of the tricks that our brain tricks us into thinking about the future in different kind of biased ways, kind of just going with whatever suited us back in the Stone Ages as human beings trying to survive. Now we've come a far way since then, so this is our opportunity today to think about the future a bit more consciously and explore and hear what my fellow panelists up here think. I will go by the order of speakers in the program. And ask you each to give us your input for 6 to 7 minutes on the topics you were provided. And we look forward to hearing from you. Starting with Wladyslaw Bartoszewski, who is a member of parliament in Poland, and tell us about the EU in the year 2030, threats, opportunities, and driver for transformation on the continent.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's rather early for not early for breakfast, it's early for talk. I don't have that much time, and the topic is rather complicated, so I have to speak fast. First, the threats, as I see it. It all depends what happens in the war in Ukraine, because we can face 3 possible scenarios. We can face a Ukrainian victory, and that would bring its opportunities. You can face a World War I scenario that Ukraine is pounded to dust over the period of years and basically becomes a state without any infrastructure, business, people, and so on. And we could face Ukrainian defeat, which means we share NATO shares a very long border with the Russian Federation, and that's a big threat. Of course, to the future EU, because the life will change completely, because we will have to then spend not 1.5% of GDP on defense, as some countries do, but not 4%, as Poland is going to do, and the US already does, but we will have to spend 8% of defense like we used to do in the Cold War. The second biggest threat, as I see it, is the IRA, and I'm not referring to the Irish Republican Army. I'm referring to the Inflation Reduction Act passed by Congress, 369 billion to be invested in climate and energy investments in the United States, which will increase competition with the UK. And may leave the long-term strategy of development of the UK, of the EU, completely in tatters. Why? Because the European Union decided that a good strategy is to rely to be the biggest producers of clean energy technology in the world, and going into green hydrogen technologies. But in order to do that, it needed a few years to prepare it, because the green hydrogen is not very green yet. For that, you need very much renewable energy sources, quite a lot of heat, means electricity, means energy plus water. We are not ready yet. We will be ready in a few years' time. But in the meantime, if we have to compete with a huge injection of money into green American business, Europe may lose its status as a big industrial hub. And that could cause, because businesses would move to the US, this would cause a tremendous amount of trouble. So that is a big threat. More specifically, if you look at the big countries in the European Union, Germany must find a new paradigm of growth, because the old paradigm, which was to sell diesel-fueled cars, is dead. And they wanted to move into this green hydrogen, but not that is under threat. At the moment, Russia for them is cut off, and they made temporarily a very strange decision to increase their investments in China, to rely again on one partner. This is questioned by other countries in Europe by saying, well, this may not be, maybe repeating the same mistake in a different way, and it will be much more difficult to disentangle from China than it was from Russia. Italy, which faces 150% debt to GDP ratio and low growth, no growth over the last 2 decades, there's a big unknown there. The French are a bit lost where to go, I'm sorry to say, and President Macron doesn't have a clear vision. So another threat is a growing populism in the EU states, member states, and no clear answer to what to do with this. Increasing disparity between various states and various matters. There is potentially a threat, is a paralysis of decision making between 27 members. The attempt of Germany to move into remove unanimity and move into majority voting is opposed by half of the EU member states, and it will not be changed, because for that you need a treaty changes, and that is not going to happen. So the EU is at the moment at the crossroads. So that's the threats. However, if there are threats, there are opportunities. So let's look at it more positively. If Europe transforms itself, which it wants to do with the Fit for 55, into a green economy, balanced economy, which is based on green hydrogen, it will reduce cost, increase investments, and produce very good results over time. The question is, do we have the time? But it's a very good idea. Opportunities in digitalization. Countries, the biggest economy of Europe, which is, of course, German, is one of the least digitalized of all member states. They are so far behind, it's just appalling. But once they put their mind together, which is the most digitalized nation in the EU? Estonia. In Estonia, you can do everything online with the exception of getting married, getting divorced, and buying property. Everything that you have to do in person. Everything else you can do online. They are phenomenal. And of course, they are a small nation, but they're very, very efficient. And I think that is a huge opportunity for the EU to follow. The opportunity is that Europe is still a large 450 million plus people market, sophisticated with lots of needs, which can be you can capitalize on that. There is an opportunity in the realization that globalization has its limits, but there's a chance for a market of 450 million people. You have a scope to start producing and in situ instead of selling it somewhere else, transporting it somewhere else, and grow, and also with forming cooperation and alliances with the states such as India, such as South Korea, such as Japan, or Vietnam. Sorry, such as Vietnam, and change the supply chain link. Go to the future by taking a step back. the drivers, definitely the energy transformation. That's absolutely probably number one. When the war in Ukraine is won, there will be reconstruction of Ukraine in which the EU will benefit tremendously. But there will be huge investment boom. The third possible one, if the war is protracted, it would be like in World War II. The buildup of the military would spend of money on the military infrastructure, gear, weapons, and capabilities would spur innovation, growth, and will bring lots of money. Look at the United States. The United States became an absolutely major superpower thanks to the Second World War in investment. So that is also an opportunity. And the last driver I would say is the artificial intelligence, because that's a big unknown. So I'm not going there.
Thank you very much. Luckily, we have someone else who will go there a bit later on this panel. Thank you so much for this overview of threats and drivers, and really running us through your views on it. And the beauty of this conference is that obviously it has reduced the distance halfway around the planet geographically between Poland and Australia, and we only have a few meters now to move next to Rory Medcalf, who's the head of the National Security College at the Australian National University, and he will tell us whether the Indo-Pacific can reclaim the Pacific.
Wow, what a challenge. Thank you very much, and congratulations all of you for being here at this hour. Look, I think drawing that global connection is a good place to start, because a lot of us know that there is, you can't come to Raisina without knowing that there is a very strategic contest or influence in the Indo-Pacific region across this vast two-ocean system that is really at the centre of global growth and, I think, long-term global strategic contestation, despite the catastrophe that we've seen with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, there's a global connection, and I think there's a thread of connection between, for example, the aggression against Ukraine, the challenge to sovereignty, and the challenge to the rules-based order globally, and some of the dynamics that we see unfolding not only in the Indo-Pacific more generally, but actually in the Pacific, in the South Pacific, more specifically, if I can say. Now, this is a futures conversation, so I'll talk a little bit about, I guess, an intergenerational time frame, the next 25 years or so across the Pacific. And it's useful to sensitise a global audience to what's happening in the Pacific. Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, the blue Pacific continent, as our friends in the Pacific like to call it, which is actually a very large part of the world, very relatively small states, relatively small populations, but an incredibly important part of the global commons in every sense. And what is unfolding there, very much on Australia's doorstep, are two intersecting trends, both very shot through with risk. And those trends are firstly, to put it very simply, rising seas and rising China. And I think the challenge for the small countries in the Pacific is that they have to engage with both of these sets of risks. And I think in terms of the impacts of climate change and the other environmental and human and health security challenges they face, of course, that's very obvious, it's very inescapable, and naturally that's at the very top of the priority list for Pacific Island countries outlined in their recent strategy of the Pacific Islands Forum, a 2050 strategy, a futures-oriented strategy for the Blue Pacific. From an Australian perspective, and not only an Australian perspective, but I think in the long run from the perspective of all small and middle powers that want to preserve their sovereignty and their choices, we can't escape the other side, the other trend as well. And so there was a time until really just the last year or two, I think, that most of our friends in the Pacific, in the South Pacific, wanted to sidestep or avoid the reality that strategic competition has come to their doorstep. And they rightly said, what's this Indo-Pacific thing all about great power competition? That's not our priority. Our priority is development and dealing with the impacts of climate change. But in many ways, from the very day in 2015 that China redrew the map of the Belt and Road Initiative and suddenly invented this branch line through Melanesia, ending mysteriously somewhere around New Zealand, strategic competition has come to the Pacific. And of course, the Pacific is no stranger to strategic competition throughout history. And so now, and this is really a message for global audiences, for global stakeholders, including in the room, including our friends in Europe or India or further afield, every nation with an interest in preserving sovereignty and a rules-based order, just as there's that profound interest in stopping the aggression against Ukraine, actually has an interest in the resilience of the South Pacific, of building societies that are able to make their own choices, their own sovereign choices when it comes to who's offering infrastructure or development assistance or security training or whatever it may be. Because I guess, and I'll conclude on a few of these points, one of the big concerns that we see from Australia is that whatever China's strategic intentions are in the Pacific, and even if just for a moment we imagine that they are benign, there is a neo-colonial dynamic at work for small countries that really are very vulnerable to infiltration and exploitation. And just as with colonialism throughout history, it may begin with a commercial footprint, it may begin with economic objectives, but it has a security footprint that follows. And so we're now facing a situation where there is a genuine effort to establish a security presence and potentially basing by China in the South Pacific. And that fundamentally changes the strategic calculus for Australia, because suddenly our East Coast becomes, if you like, a front line of national defence. What to do? I'll conclude on this point. There is a multipolar set of solutions, and in fact, if you look not only at the role of Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Japan as development partners and security partners in the Pacific, there are other stakeholders. I think it's good to see increased interest and engagement by India with the recent visit by Minister Jaishankar. It's good to see, I think, stepped up European interest. Even other players, South Korea, Canada, for example, are beginning to look at what they can do. And so the challenge here will be building coordination, not excluding China from a region where it has a right to be, but providing the maximum number of choices and options for those societies, whether it's Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, and many other countries of the Pacific, or indeed the Solomon Islands, to develop in ways that reflect their democratic choices. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Rory. And you already mentioned the connections between the economic relations and the security implications that can have, how maybe also economic relations can be weaponized. And apart from obviously the movement of goods and capital, which is an important aspect of globalization, our next speaker will talk about the movement of people, the third element in this globalization conundrum. We have Jenny Mander, a professor from the University of Cambridge, who's here to tell us about a planet on the move and whether globalization will recognize the importance of migration.
Well, good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be at this sunrise session. Is migration an emerging trend? Migration is as old as humanity, but it is inextricably linked with globalization. It's an overwhelmingly positive force for the common good. The numbers are small. In 2020, there were 3.6% of the world's population living in a country other than their place of birth, and the vast majority had crossed international borders in a safe, orderly, and regular way. They'd done so by choice, for work, for study, or indeed for love. Migrants bring different perspectives, they bring much needed skills, and they above all bring new ideas that foster innovation that is the motor for growth. Migrants support the SDGs, and since the 1990s, international remittances have far outstripped foreign aid. And migration is the oldest form of international relations, positively correlating with peace and stability. It's often overlooked that the highest number of emigrants, as well as immigrants, reside in countries at the top of the Human Development Index. But this, of course, isn't the prevailing image of migration. especially but not only in Europe, where migration continues to be a polarizing topic and where the overwhelming focus of public discourse and policy debate has been on irregular and involuntary migration. In 2020, there were over 89 million people living in displacement, of which over 26 million were documented refugees, 4 million asylum seekers. And these are, alas, the highest figures on record and set to increase. Set to increase not only from conflict, but also climate change. The World Bank has estimated that by 2050, there will be 143 million people moving between countries due to the adverse impact of climate change. And this will, of course, affect some of the poorest countries in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. An international resolve is currently insufficient, woefully insufficient, to address the universal human rights of the stateless. Now, of the emerging trends concerning migration, I want to foreground the adverse consequences for cultural diversity, that motor of globalization. It's estimated that by the middle of the 21st century, half the 7,000 languages spoken in the world will be extinct, because a high percentage of these are spoken in those regions that are most at risk from environmental degradation or from rising sea levels. So those regions in equatorial Africa or in the Indo-Pacific Ocean, of which we've just heard. When language communities are forced to move to countries where their unique heritage isn't appreciated and protected, it's not just the language that's lost, but the knowledge that it represents. Our common future, I hope we'll all agree, depends on cultural diversity as much as on biodiversity. But culture has become a battleground. An increasing hostility to cultural diversity not only impacts migration, but the interconnectivity on which globalization depends. An emerging trend, alas, is that territorial frontiers are being increasingly aligned with seductive yet simplistic notions of cultural identity. The nation state is being reimagined as a cultural container, and these borders are being reintroduced in everyday interaction, distinguishing between an us and a them, those who belong and those who don't. And this is undermining the cohesion and the dynamism. There's no growth without change. So the tech revolution, of which there's been much talk over the past couple of days, is changing the patterns of migration in fundamental ways, and indeed its governance. Questions that we need to battle with is, will this serve or sacrifice the cultural diversity that makes people on the move across fertilizer? There are, of course, many opportunities to be seized, but there are also dangers. Self-publishing is a source of information and solidarity, but also a well-established means for disseminating unregulated disinformation. AI will offer better migrant tracking, but also surveillance. More fundamentally, however, I want to stress that the tech revolution is impacting fundamentally the patterns of migration, replacing the needs for certain sorts of migrant labor. So what will be the impact on international remittances, which have played such an important role in redistributing wealth? The trend is towards increasingly selective migration management, immigration shopping. And perhaps we need a note of caution to be sounded about over-privileging, uniquely privileging global talent in science, engineering, and technologies. I think it's illustrative that the UK's immigration policy gives 20 points for a PhD in STEM. It's a PhD, that's already ruling quite a few people out, but you only get half those number of points if your PhD is in another subject. SDG 4 also promotes international mobility of students for the science and technology subjects. So I hope that the India-Australia education collaboration and the global skills mapping will bear in mind that a global future also depends on people with skills in other areas. Digital connectivity doesn't automatically translate into sensitive, reciprocal, intercultural relations any more than highways and shipping lanes. 2/3 of current global conflict has a cultural dimension. And as cultural diversity is a common good and a source for innovation, this is problematic. So I'd suggest that if we leave culture out of our policy frameworks, we're leaving a vacuum that's all too easily filled with essentializing notions of cultural identity that are rooted in narrow and superficial understandings of a nation's past. And those are all too easily weaponized to serve particular political agendas. Now, since the beginning of the new millennium, there has been more than lip service at national and international levels to the importance and indeed the urgency of intercultural dialogue. Since 2002, UNESCO has had a World Day every year to celebrate cultural diversity and development. One day a year is not enough. We've just completed a decade of International Decade for the Rapprochement of Cultures. The question is how much has been achieved. I think if we look around the international landscape, we still see that the rapprochement of cultures has not been well established. So has the, and will the importance of culture make any inroads into foreign policy? Or do foreign policy makers think that culture is inert and incidental? So if globalization is to recognize the importance of migration, I suggest we need a strong and intelligent understanding of the dynamics and diversity of culture and of the divisive nature of cultural politics. In 2018, the 152 signatories of the Global Compact of Migration, which included India but did not include Poland, Israel, and Hungary, were amongst those nations that recognized the importance of intercultural dialogue. That's a document that recognizes intercultural dialogue at local level. We now have, and we'll hear more about, the capacities of tech to promote intercultural dialogue at grassroots level across international borders. It seems to me that that's an exciting future that we need to seize. So is migration an emerging trend? I think we need to worry about it being a stopping trend, a police trend, if we want to actually have a common future in which there is still the global diversity that is a stimulus for growth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for taking the long view on trends and human mobility, and also, some food for thought on how which direction things should go into. And you already provided also the transition to our next topic, which is synthetic humanity, and how exactly the accessibility and democratization of digital tools, such as ChatGPT, will impact national and international politics. For this topic, we have Thomas Greminger, who is the director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and obviously also the former Secretary General of the OSCE, and he will tell us more about his views on the future of synthetic humanity.
Thank you very much. Good morning. In his dinner speech at the opening of this conference, the Indian Foreign Secretary asked, is ChatGPT going to be a tempest, or will it be a lighthouse? Well, I guess the short answer is that it has probably the potential to become either of it, depending on how we will handle it. Let me now try to offer you a slightly more differentiated answer. Released by OpenAI, an AI research laboratory, ChatGPT stands for Chat Generative Retrained Transformer. It is a large language model using deep learning techniques to generate human-like responses to text inputs. It is trained on a vast amount of text data and can understand and generate texts in various languages and styles. This user-friendly AI tool, ChatGPT, has already attracted hundreds of millions of users since its launch in November last year. In recent days, AI content generated by the bot has been used, for instance, in US Congress, in Colombian courts, and in a speech by Israel's president. Just a couple of days ago, for the first time in my home country, in Switzerland, a parliamentary intervention was drafted by artificial intelligence software. A Swiss MP decided to use ChatGPT to draft his intervention precisely to demand better regulation of these new technologies. I believe we are here at a tipping point for artificial intelligence. With ChatGPT and other AI models that can communicate in plain English, write and revise text, and write code, the technology has suddenly become very useful to a very broad population. And this clearly has enormous implications and considerations, including ethical ones. Let me start by looking at some risks and benefits of AI, and in particular of ChatGPT for the democratic process. Democracy is a fundamentally human way of organizing our society. And where an AI, whether it is ChatGPT that is writing human text, or another AI that is figuring out human strategy, can do that at a speed and scale that humans simply can't. On the one hand, this could be beneficial for society, but it could also take over entire processes and really subvert the intent of this very human-centered system. There are potential benefits, although it is difficult to say at this point if the risks outweigh them. For instance, ChatGPT may potentially equalize information asymmetries between different societal levels, as it facilitates access to contextualized information for the public. In highly unequal societies, AI and ChatGPT may bridge knowledge divides, granted, obviously, that individuals have access to these tools and digital literacy over them. Artificial intelligence like ChatGPT could have a seismic effect on democracy by replacing humans in the lobbying process. ChatGPT can already determine whether government bills are relevant to a company with 75% accuracy. It can draft a letter to Congress and even suggest recommendations for amending the bill in question. AI lobbyists will make the already complex political landscape even more challenging. And there is clearly a risk that the already influential will become even more so, and that the noise that smaller parties have to shout over to be heard will have to become louder than ever. ChatGPT could write letters to newspaper editors, write comments submitted in regulatory processes, and eventually AI systems could exploit policy-making weaknesses by targeting key legislators. OpenAI researchers have long been nervous about chatbots falling into the hands of malicious actors, writing already in 2019 a paper where they stated there, and I quote, "Concern that its capabilities could lower costs of disinformation campaigns and aid in the malicious pursuit of monetary gain, a particular political agenda, and or a desire to create chaos or confusion." End of quote. This in 2019. Let me move on to risks and benefits for international relations. Over the past decade, significant advances in AI have led to many debates about its potential social, economic, and security impact. However, interestingly enough, little sustained attention has been paid to the effect of AI on international relations or how the technology impacts the work of diplomats and policymakers. At the same time, advances in AI have put new topics on the international agenda, have challenged geostrategic relations, served as tools for diplomats and negotiators, and also created new opportunities, but also concerns about human rights. Foreign policy is transforming swiftly as countries turn to algorithms to predict events significant to business and geopolitics. Indeed, AI could prove useful in negotiations, in analyzing past negotiations, and in predicting the outcome of ongoing discussions and negotiations. There are, however, also negative aspects to it. For instance, ChatGPT may undermine trust in diplomats and their institutions, while decreasing diplomats' ability to formulate shared and global responses to challenges. Countries like China have adopted AI and ML around diplomacy and related government areas. For example, China introduced an AI foreign policy toolbox with its new generation plan to be the world leader in AI by 2030. Other countries, such as Russia, Canada, the United States, use AI as an international diplomacy instrument. Areas include international security, cybersecurity, threat monitoring, autonomous weapons system, monitoring of concluded agreements, military power and warfare. In recent years, nuclear states engaged in a race to deploy AI to enable the operation of new types of weapons, including hypersonic missiles or uncrewed submarines. Generally, the military use of artificial intelligence increased substantially, opening the possibilities of cyber wars and disguised attacks on nuclear weapons command and control systems. It clearly also shortened the decision-making time available. These developments can lead to confrontation by accident, incident, or intent, and are therefore very risky. Let me conclude by a couple of thoughts on regulation. As ChatGPT moves into the house, we must acknowledge the challenges it poses, and we must move to mitigate its potentially negative impact. One way would be to open ChatGPT's black box, to regulate open AI systems and ensure that each answer includes the sources of information and databases used to generate knowledge. A new ethical agenda for AI in political advertising and content on online platforms is probably required. And given the cross-border nature of the problem, this agenda would have to be backed by global consensus and action. Ultimately, the appropriate level of regulation for ChatGPT and AI in general will depend on specific risks and potential harms associated with the technology. As with any new and powerful technology, it is important to carefully consider the potential impacts and take steps to ensure that it is used in a responsible and ethical manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas Greminger, for laying out the opportunities, but also the dangers involved, which I think also highlights that, I mean, ChatGPT is generative and predictive AI, and this may be also the impetus for humans to realize where they have choices, right? What's not already predicted and set out, or what will not be generated, and where we can really influence the course of events. We will move now from this very broad kind of overarching issue that affects many areas of life to a specific region. We have Lara Setrakian, who is the president of the Applied Policy Research Center in Armenia. And she will tell us, beyond what's apparent, who are the actors, what are their interests, and what are the conflict drivers in the region of the Caucasus.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and I'm glad I get to address everyone when they're a little bit less hungry and a little more fed. So it's my pleasure to do so. First, I also want to thank Thomas for his time at the OSCE as Secretary General, where he worked so closely on peace building in the South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Very much appreciated. So I've been asked to address this as calm in the Caucasus, which would be wonderful. We would love calm in the Caucasus. But I also want to prompt you, somewhat challenge you to think of this as a module within the future of peace building and problem solving. This is not just a small neighborhood squabble, This is an issue that has major global interests at play and dynamics that are impacting how it plays out. It has been a tumultuous 3 years in our region, no doubt, at a great cost to human life. And what we're seeing now is a breakdown of international norms and practices that are very dangerous into might is right dynamics, where the risk of ethnic cleansing looms very real. So this is as vivid as it gets for our neighborhood. We're in the post-Cold War period, post-squared. Calm in the Caucasus used to be something that Russia, the US, and France could work on together and could frankly more or less agree on, although some might argue that Russia benefited from the continual tumult of the issue itself. And if you look back at the origins of this conflict, which are also not particular to the Caucasus, there are many Caucasus, one could say, across the post-Soviet space, areas where in the 1920s, particularly under Joseph Stalin, certain small ethnic majority areas were allotted to other essentially non-co-ethnic Soviet republics. So basically you plant a little seed of unrest and ongoing conflict within different republics, thereby forcing reliance on Moscow to keep them all calm. It was a strategy designed to create conflict, and 100 years later it works. So that is relevant, and to debug that would take something very deft and wise. It used to be a poetic, even romantic project for the US and the new Russia, the Russian Federation, to work together in the 90s to problem solve in the former Soviet arena. But that romance has been lost to some extent. The polarization over the conflict and the war in Ukraine has left the prospect of collaboration both faint and quaint. So you have this terrible unresolved history as a driver of conflict, and the mechanics of the moment that are essentially fueling, and I really wish I could be future forward. I will try to be by the end of this, but we're really stuck in the mud right now in the Caucasus, so let's try to dig ourselves out. The one could say, I'll use a very difficult term to justify, but I can stand by it, I think. The original sin in this round of conflict, in this round of turmoil, I believe, was the retraction of US diplomacy in 2020 under President Donald Trump. There was a significantly reduced interest in diplomatic engagement and active peace building. So essentially, the US abandoned its share of carrying the weight and the active diplomacy on peace building. And so what happened was that you essentially had a vacuum with Azerbaijan breaking away from negotiations and using force to resolve the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, which was always a risk. Both parties have a lot to account for over 30 years, but in that particular episode, what the lack of restraint and the vacuum created such dynamics. Peace building and peacekeeping were outsourced to Russia, which I think proved unwise. But at the time, they were essentially given carte blanche to write what was a ceasefire deal in November 2020 that just has not stuck. It depended on, yes, the largesse and goodwill of Russia to maintain order in the South Caucasus. It no longer became a three-way effort. It became a singular police force. And rather than what was traditionally a rules-based and diplomacy-led, or sort of tripartite diplomacy, became more like horse trading between Russia and Turkey, which we've also seen in the Syrian context, we've seen in the Libyan context. This is becoming a norm that is quite dangerous. So now this, what had been previously a strategic win for Moscow, with a footprint of peacekeepers in a very strategic corner of Armenia, Iran, and Azerbaijan, has begun to fail in its effectiveness, and that's led to the vacuum that we see now. And I do think it's fair to say, as a result, that we learned the world needs global diplomatic mechanisms to work, not negotiations based on narrow political interests of specific players looking to make specific gains. The second thing to understand is the impact of global power competition in this part of the world, and I would scope in as well the broader Middle East. The lack of meaningful interaction between the West and Russia fragments the field of peacemaking and peace building. And so in the context of Nagorno-Karabakh, that results in competing tracks of peace negotiations. You now have a Brussels-led track backed by Washington and a Moscow-led track. And while Armenia and Azerbaijan get accused of platform shopping, what I see more frequently is a lack of control and general consistency by any one of those tracks, with some fair amount of backsliding on commitments at the negotiating table. We've seen this in the Syrian context as well, with the launch of the Astana process by Russia and Turkey, which had a somewhat similar competing platform flavor, governed by different interests and not particularly effective in safeguarding the long-term good of the Syrian people. So this is a trend that I think needs to be watched out for. The fact that at the moment Azerbaijan is in a significantly stronger military and natural resource position, plus the nature of domestic politics in Azerbaijan, has incentivized the use of force or the threat of force as a negotiating tool. So we see much more coercive diplomacy. And that results in a pursuit of an escalating series of demands. One could argue that even if one achieves a deal in such a context, it would seem more concessionary and more like a capitulation to the Armenian side. But I think that's less of and therefore perhaps less likely to stick in the long run. I think the greater concern right now is actually reaching a deal of any kind, given the current dynamics. Again, both sides in that particular conflict have a lot to account for, but this trend is what I want to point to. What happens when there is no mechanism for problem solving and peace building, and what do you need from key players to reverse that and to see something more effective? The goal here should be peace and prosperity for all, with no one country eating its neighbor for lunch, and also without a shredding of the Geneva Conventions and human rights. That's a core tenet that we are standing by in Ukraine, and we shouldn't tolerate its breakdown in the South Caucasus or anywhere else. There is much to say about key factors for global prosperity. Should this work? If we win, if we succeed in creating a stable and lasting peace in the South Caucasus, transit routes are a factor, energy supply is a factor, and of course, always somewhere in the mix is the potential for a military strike on Iran, always a factor, waxes and wanes. The region is going to need wise and continuous diplomacy in configurations that don't disappear based on the political will of Washington. This American administration is rather highly engaged. What would come next in a potential Republican administration? The cause of peace and stability needs new partners, keeping negotiations on track and adding additional weight to them. And so I do challenge you to think beyond frankly, both within and beyond the US, West, and Russia paradigm. What do new partners, not to put too much weight on Australia, but what do other powers have to contribute in general to the enforcement of rules and norms at this time in human history? What does deterrence look like? It's not quite the hard deterrence of old, but what does it look like to encourage everyone's best behavior on their way to peace and prosperity for all without eating their neighbors for lunch? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lara, for challenging our thinking and provoking really some deep thoughts on how these peace-building mechanisms that you mentioned for problem solving and really getting to a peaceful solution can be reinvigorated, but also strengthened and designed differently than maybe before, given the new circumstances. Building on this call for problem solving and peace building mechanisms, we have our last speaker, Louise van Schreik, from the head of the unit for EU and Global Affairs at the Clingendael Institute think tank in the Netherlands. And she will also tell us about problem-solving mechanisms for peaceful solutions, exactly on the topic of whether there will be conflict at borders or if we can save the climate without trade wars.
Yes, thank you so much. And I will try to keep it short because I realized that there is a time's up notification.
You get as much time as everyone else. So
we'll do our best. I was asked to speak about climate and trade relationship, and I think that's very topical since in January, India wrote a letter to WTO complaining about the protectionist nature of carbon border measures. And we all know that in December, the EU actually reached agreement on the first of its kind, the Carbon Border Adjustment Measure, CBAM, I always think about CBAM, about, you know, a comic strip and a comic, and that you have this big balloon, and the EU wants to introduce something, and I will explain later on why, but it's perceived by the rest of the world, you know, like a bam, you know, like a punch in the face, and a protectionist measure. So why was the EU? Why is the EU doing this basically? So it's a levy on imports of steel, cement, fertilizer, well, all these carbon-heavy products which within the EU are covered by the EU emissions trading scheme, so they have a carbon price. So what happened was that this carbon price will go up tremendously because the EU has way more ambitious climate policy targets for 2030, and beyond that probably even more. So companies in the EU were saying, well, actually, if this continues like it, we will have to relocate because we cannot compete on global markets anymore. So this is basically where the origin of the carbon border adjustment measure is coming from, really to ensure the level playing field for these companies in Europe that are covered by this carbon price. And the price will also be equally high. So the price of steel that you develop in a dirty way in Europe is equally high as the price of steel that's produced in India or elsewhere in the world. If you become cleaner, the price goes down. So this is the idea, and that was agreed upon in December. Well, meanwhile, we know that this takes also place in a context where there's other climate measures that have potentially a trade distorting impact. And you were already mentioning the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, but also the EU's green industrial policies might have, you know, might be perceived as, let's say, distorting trade. So the measure was really about, you know, using also market power Europe for climate policies, and also in the hope that other countries would consider ways to escape the application of CBAM. And you might wonder, how can you escape? If you were a producer of steel or cement or fertilizer, how can you escape, you know, to pay this big levy at the border of the EU? And actually, there's two ways of doing that. The first is that you have your own carbon price for the EU, preferably through an emissions trading scheme, but they have already stated that it could also be other, let's say, carbon policies that have, let's say, similar implications, or how that exactly would work, I'm not entirely sure. But that's up to the European Commission. So for instance, here for India, there is already the PET system, there's already energy efficiency measures, and there's also consideration of a more, you know, harsh emissions trading scheme. But also we see that in many other parts of the world. So we see that in the EU accession countries, Turkey, the Western Balkans. So we already see, let's say, the shadow of CBAM running forward in many countries saying, well, if our companies have to pay a price when entering the European markets, then maybe we should consider doing something at home to avoid that, and then at least they pay to us, and then we might be able to give that back behind the table, or in the back door through subsidies like the EU is doing. But this is something that you already see happening. Well, another way to escape CBAM would be to do reshuffling. So for instance, if you consider green hydrogen for steel production here in India, that would be your steel that you're going to export to Europe, or the cars that are manufactured by it, or the other product. And you would keep the dirty products for your own market or for other export markets that you want to go to. So is this WTO compatible? Well, the EU, of course, says it does, and the European Commission officials have worked on that to the greatest detail, so they're really convinced that it would work. But of course, eventually we will have to see whether that will work out, and we can only, the proof is in the pudding, that's what I wanted to say. The proof is in the pudding by eating, so we will only be able to see if there is a case in front of the WTO. And we all know that's also incredibly difficult because there are no judges in the highest WTO appellate body. So that's going to be complicating things. So what will happen next? From October onwards, companies exporting to the EU will have to hand over their carbon content of their products, and then there will be a pilot phase. So then the EU is kind of calculating what they should pay if it enters into force. In 2026 it will. And in the meantime, some more legal details will be worked out. Well, we might see WTO cases. We already saw a lot of opposition, for instance, by the basic countries at the COP27 in Egypt. For me, an important question mark is what happens with the US, because we all know that the US has subsidies, Inflation Reduction Act, but it doesn't have a carbon pricing policy, and also the likelihood of the US adopting a carbon pricing policy is not that big. I mean, they tried through their Clean Air Act, but the Supreme Court didn't buy it, and that was rejected. So that's really difficult, that the EU is basing its climate change policy on a carbon price. The US is using subsidies, so how is that compatible? And how would that also provide a basis for exempting the US? So the US, for now, is also among the ones that would be faced with CBAM. So then, indeed, this question of an exemption on what? This is, I think, also the US is also one of the reasons why Vice President Timmermans of the European Commission has said, well, you can also have climate policies, but how exactly that would look like, it's a bit of a mystery to me. And the other question is then, how would this also fit in with the broader debates on the climate clubs as they take place in G7 and advocated for by Germany? So the idea that you work together on common climate policies, how can you do that if, some use carbon pricing, others use mainly subsidies to achieve the energy transition? So all in all, I think it's a fascinating time, and we will have to see, we published last July a policy brief. We saw already that some other countries were already contemplating on their own carbon policies to escape CBAM. It seems to have its, implicit workings from that respect, but it has also created a lot of opposition with a lot of developing countries. And for instance, the case of Mozambique is often pointed out as one of the affected countries, whereas it's a country that, in terms of its overall contribution to climate change, is of course not a big polluter. We will also have to see how Europe and member states are really going to support their own industries, and industry is still complaining that even with CBAM, okay, they can compete with others who want to export to the EU, but what about their exports towards the rest of the world? So they're still asking for support in that respect. So this is an ongoing topic, and we will likely to see more of that. Then perhaps my final point, when I was preparing for this and reading a bit in Indian newspapers, I noticed that there is a big fear that eventually CBAM will be applied to many more sectors and to all exports of a country like India to the EU. And I was wondering where this was coming from. Even the year 2034 was mentioned explicitly in some articles. I think in the end of the day, CBAM can only be applied to sectors which in the EU were covered by emissions trading. Because otherwise, indeed, it would not be WTO compatible. I mean, you cannot put a carbon price on products if you don't have one at home. So I think, be careful also, let's say, what your fears are. Maybe it's not that bad. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Lise, for outlining essentially the choices on this essential topic that will determine how we tackle kind of the challenges of humanity's shared future, right? I mean, if we find a mechanism to solve these quarrels over what to do about the climate, that will be pretty essential for a range of topics in the future. And I would like to thank each one of you again for stimulating our thinking on this broad range of topics, for outlining essentially the historical contingencies and path dependencies, really providing an analysis of the current state of the affairs from your points of view, highlighting really the challenges that you see, some of the ways forward, and also really highlighting that there are opportunities, but it will essentially depend on our choices, on how we leverage the technology that is there, how we leverage essentially the concepts that is there, how we deal with the societal forces that we see in the political realm, nationally and internationally, that will determine on whether we find solutions and what types of solutions we find, if they are innovative or if they just go back to some of the kind of playbooks that we had in the past. This is the point where I would like to ask the room if there's anyone who would like to provide an additional perspective on some of the topics we have heard about. And I see someone here, please.
So thank you for this very rich and a little bit overwhelming session, because the variety of topics was great. But thank you very much to all of you for your insights. My question, I have two questions. First would go to Medcalf, because you presented the situation in the South Pacific as rather a threat, that the strategic competition is something which is basically endangering the region. But isn't it a chance that the states which were a little bit neglected over the last couple of decades, that they get much more interest, and that Australia, maybe China, the US need to compete? Could it be also a chance for countries like, let's say, Fiji? That's my maybe question. And my second question would go to Louise van Schulk and Wladyslaw Bartoszewski about Europe, because you both mentioned the IRA and also the climate and carbon schemes. And shouldn't we think about our carbon policies in another way, in the times of war and conflict? Because precisely the industries we need in Europe quite badly now are very much carbon heavy. So if we need to build more tanks, if we need to have more ammunition, how does it really fit into our climate ambitions? Thank you.
I'm Professor Ruby Pavankar from Japan, and I head the Asia-Pacific Association of Allergy, Asthma and Clinical Immunology and the former president of the World Allergy Organization. We've been very active in the space of climate action and One Health. And I think this is a very important issue when we talk about migration, we talk about GDP or economies or the world we live in and the world we want to give to our future. And I think we all agree on that. And climate action, climate change and air pollution, loss of biodiversity has significantly impacted lifestyle diseases. And that's part of our SDG to actually address that. And when we talk about that, this translates into health negative effects. So not only just the physical health of illness or lack of wellness, but also mental health, lack of work productivity, all which translates into a poor GDP. And we're also talking about this affecting resource poor countries. So I would like to understand, how are we going to talk? When we talk about climate change, we talk about sea levels, water levels, the icebergs, all glaciers and everything. What about human health? What about One Health? This is so important. This is a key aspect of our India's presidency also, as well as the World Health Organization's mission and organizations like us. And I believe that this needs not just the engagement of governments, but also private organizations, different institutions, as well as medical organizations like us who are passionately working towards it, because we are present there in COP also, and we try to direct action against how can we address this towards wellness and a better economy, targeting climate mitigation towards digital health and towards One Health.
My name is Bhavna. I've lived and worked in Afghanistan. And while I found this panel discussion really exciting, I also want to understand if you're moving to a definition of negative peace. In the sense, we just put up with what is instead of actively resolving and finding positive solutions. So as a world, as a civilization, is that what we're settling for? Is something I'm just curious to learn more about.
Look, great question. Isn't strategic competition an opportunity, I guess? And look, the answer to that is yes, partly yes. Of course, Pacific Island countries are looking at it this way. Some of their governments are being very pragmatic and saying, well, we can and should take benefits, infrastructure, development, education from whichever quarter, and in fact almost create a kind of bidding contest between partners and donors. But I think there's a deeper thread of integrity behind that, because all of these countries in the end are democracies, imperfect democracies, but democracies nonetheless. And I guess, and this is my sense from recent visits to the region, if they had a choice, they would generally choose democratic partners if those partners were willing to provide the level of support that they need. So I think perhaps you could argue that a few of our countries are now doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. We're renewing our focus on development in the Pacific, partly because of the strategic challenge from China. You won't get our governments saying that openly, but it's a well-known subtext. But the answer will be, I think, helping to develop a set of standards for aid, infrastructure, education, the development of the region, that all donors, all friends, all partners need to live up to, including China, and that will be the ultimate test as to whether China's intentions there are benign. So, I broadly agree.
Thank you so much for the question, and you touch upon a topic I'm really passionate about, and that's about potential in the defense industry to decarbonize too, and also the opportunity that it could bring to Europe, also to maybe change its dependency on US defense industry. Yeah? And also the opportunities that it could be to enhance strategic autonomy, not only of European economy, but also of operational effectiveness in the field. Because we know from the war how sensitive all the oil and diesel supply lines have been to the logistical operations. We've seen the lines of tanks standing still because they were not able to fuel them properly, the attacks on the fuel storage places. So if we can have a military defense industry that's decarbonized, it could also have huge operational benefits for basically fossil importing Europe, because it's also a high cost factor of the military operations. And I think also if we focus on green industrial policies in Europe, and usually it's the same factories that produce, dual use military and civilian products. I mean, if we go for this decarbonization, let's include the defense sector. And the European Commission is coming up with a new communication later this year in spring, which will also focus on these issues a bit more deeply. Then I also appreciated very much your remark on One Health, planetary health. It's also a topic that we work on a lot at the Klingenau Institute, this relationship between the environment, health, pollution issues. Just of tremendous importance. And finally, I wanted to say, but very briefly, the negative piece. I think also climate change could prevent a lot of opportunities to go into environmental peace building, shared resources. Yesterday I was here in the water session, the water security issue. If you see climate change as the common enemy in many regions of the world, it could also bring together within countries parties at conflict or between countries, because very often, these are considered transboundary issues. And also the energy transition could provide a lot of opportunities for improving access to clean energy, access to energy in places where it hasn't been economic growth. The attempt is really to merge the climate and peace agendas. But in reality, we see that these worlds are still so separated, and there's also a lot of fear in climate and development communities to link up with security and peace issues, and in the security and peace world, that this is soft, not important future topics. Yeah, thanks.
I think you have to distinguish between the short term and the long term, because long term, Louise is absolutely right. We can plan for long term synergies and cooperation and so on. But short term, the stark reality is there is nothing more important than security of one state. Nothing. Because if there is no sovereign state, you don't control any aspects of life. No health, no climate change, no economy, nothing. That is why, to give you an example of a very green state, that is Germany in Europe, where 100% of energy needs in good days, can be supplied purely from wind and solar panels. And yet, given the situation, Germany has now started to produce electricity from lignite, the most dirty possible fuel you can find. Why? Because it's needed. You have to face realities. You cannot say, oh, well, we have to be green. Yes, we do. We have Fit for 55 agenda. We want to limit emissions, but we have a war. And if that war reaches the border of NATO, the whole world would turn upside down. As I said earlier, we will start spending 8% of GDP of every country on defense. We will turn the economies into defense economies. We start producing weapons which we do not have. What this war proved, that Europe is incapable at the moment of defending itself without the United States. There's no chance at all without the United States we would survive. And the United States, it's not the United States of 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. They have no ammunition. They're running out of missiles. I'm not talking ICBM, strategic nuclear missiles. I'm talking missiles for artillery, guided missiles. They don't have this stuff. We cannot afford to proceed with the agenda that would endanger our own security. That is a stark reality. This is a geopolitical change, and this is what we have to keep in mind. Having said all that, the longer term and the strategic autonomy, frankly speaking, I'm involved in sectors dead. It's simply not going to happen. 68% of the Germans say we don't want to get involved in any military matters. 68%. A couple of months ago, a few months ago, General Burkhard, Chief of Staff of the French army, said, if we have a war in France, we'll lose in a month, because we don't have the weapons, we don't have the ammunition, we're not prepared for a conventional war. This has to put a certain different perspective on the progressive agenda for change, which I share, but we have to take a step back for the time being. Having said that, Luis is completely right on a cooperation, because the question the lady asked, we have now an example of two states completely different, like Israel and Jordan, cooperating because Israelis give Jordan water, which they don't have, and the Jordanians put solar panels in the desert producing electricity, which makes possible to desalinate the water which they are given. So that kind of cooperation is possible, but not when you have a war in the middle of your country. That is not going to happen. But yes, long term I'm optimistic, but short term it's not necessarily so.
But it took us a year to develop the COVID vaccines. And also when the war started, at least in my own country, the Netherlands, people thought, Ukrainians would have 3 to 5 days. And they're still there. So I also wanted to believe a bit in humanity, and also with regards to the investments that are now made in the defense industry. At least we have to make a start, with also considering alternatives, even for tanks and jet fuels and Navy ships. I mean, I realize very much that we cannot overnight, decarbonize them, make them zero carbon neutral, but at least we should make a start with it.
We have to soon wrap up. Thanks a lot. It's been interesting the whole time. It's getting even more interesting. We will continue these conversations. I know Thomas would also like to respond to the negative peace question, and I will also leave it to you both, obviously, to react and provide additional views on the future of the topics that were raised.
I think positive peace should obviously remain our vision and our ambition, but at the same time, I think we need to acknowledge realities. We live in a world that is characterized by increasing polarization, by increasing geopolitical competition, by a protracted conflict that has turned violent again in the South Caucasus, by a war in the heart of Europe. And I think in these circumstances, we will have to set, as a priority to establish a negative peace first, and this, of course, obliges us to again focus on issues of hard security. But I also share your concern in a medium to long-term perspective. I wouldn't want to live in a world, that is dominated, that has a security order that is exclusively geared or relies on deterrence only. At some point, I think we need to come back to a security order that, again, integrates elements of cooperative security. Only that would allow us to tackle, the big global challenges, security challenges of the future. But I'm afraid this is a very tall order if you have a war ongoing. If the level of trust among key stakeholders of global security is as low as it is today, and I think it would all be much easier if we would have a settled end of this war that would be perceived to be by and large fair by all major stakeholders. I think this would allow us to then again look towards a medium and long-term future with more cooperation and less reliance on deterrence only.
Thank you. Jenny, please.
Thank you. I'd like to respond to the question about health and mental health in particular. For mental health, inclusion matters. It matters to have good, strong social relationships to feel that one actually belongs in a place. And while we talk about these big, intractable global issues, I think we do need to address the question of partnerships, and partnerships not just at the top levels, but actually engaging the whole of society. We need to think positively about mobilizing our assets, which are the billions of people who live on this world. That's the best way and the long-term way to peace building. And that comes through new structures that don't enclose people within false boundaries, but that use those boundaries to operate on a political level in a positive way, but that encourage people to actually be flexible as global citizens. And it seems to me that that's one of the problems of high-level interstate conversations, is that they tend to leave out the people who are very diverse but have huge talent and great peace making capacities in the longer term. So I do think that education is absolutely crucial and not to be put on hold while these other issues are being tackled.
I'll end very briefly. If we want to do better with peace building, we need new formulas and new partners. Let's see what India can do within the boundaries of its worldview and its emerging foreign policy. Let's see what other states can do. Let's not be too Eurocentric. Let's be Eurocentric, but not too Eurocentric. Within the norms and frameworks that have been agreed to for peace building, how can new partners be brought on board to add more weight and, in a sense, more deterrence by nature of their all that they have to offer, not just India, but others as well, to be part of these processes. I think that will be a huge help, and it will actually relieve some of the bandwidth burden that traditional partners always feel that they have to carry.
Thank you very much. In the beginning of this session, I mentioned the biases that can cloud our thinking about the future. I think we all agree this group of experts helped us get around that, because the best recipe is to continuously challenge one's own thinking, get perspectives from different parts of the world, from different points of view, from different backgrounds. That's what we're doing here. Thank you all very much again. Thanks also for the additional perspectives from the room. It's time for us also now to have breakfast now. The insights of the session will feed into a Raisina special report and also a Raisina Trends video. So that will be an excellent basis to continue the conversation moving forward. Thank you all very much.